Judges chapter 18. We're up to chapter 18. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. We're going to, in one slide here, capture chapter 17 through 21. Last week, we talked about cursings, blessings, stealings, and idolatry. There was a man named Micah, and his mother's name wasn't given, but somebody stole 1,100 pieces of silver from her. She curses the guy, and then the son fesses up. Micah fesses up, and he says, "Mom, I did it." And she says, "Oh, bless you, my son. Take the money. I dedicated all of it, but only take 200 of it and make an idol out of it." And so you see the slippery slope begin. Chapter 18, the Danites, we're going to cover a little bit about their movement from the southern part of Israel to the northern part of Israel. They come and they run into the house of Micah and they meet the Levite and they say, "You just come be with us. And instead of serving just one family, you can serve the entire tribe." There's a break there, those dotted lines. That particular section starts off by saying there was a certain Levite. The Bible doesn't say if it was the same one or a different one. So there's a break there. And what happens is a Levite is going to visit this town called Gibeah. And you see, they're going to visit there. He and his concubine, the men of the town want to sodomize the Levite. Sounds just like Lot. The man of the house offers his daughter and the concubine, just like Lot. There were no angels there to protect the women, so the concubine gets violated. She dies on the doorstep of the house, and the Levite takes her home, chops her up into 12 pieces, sends a chunk of her to every one of the tribes, and they decide they're going to have a civil war against the tribe of Benjamin. Those were the ones responsible for the abuse of the concubine. They kill off all but 600 of the men. Then they allow their daughters to be kidnapped by those 600. And then they go home and chill. Apathy. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And you'll see that verse several times. You'll see half of that verse at one point. And whether you read it or whether I say it, and I might be saying it a couple times when it's not on the screen, you need to be hearing loud and clear, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. They didn't do what was right. They did what they thought was right. So chapter 18 begins, there were 5 scouts sent to spy out the land. These are the Danites that had the real estate in the south. They didn't take their own land, even though they had 64,000 soldiers, second only to the tribe of Judah. So they decide they're going to find some other real estate, and 5 guys were sent out. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. This is what they found. The section that they took over is considered one of the most beautiful spots of the entire nation of Israel. Keep in mind, Israel covers everything from Mount Hermon, which is snowbound entire year, all the way down to the Dead Sea, the lowest part of the entire globe, where in like April, it's 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And they've got everything else in between. So the Danites are going to scout out the land. They see this. A little bit closer up, they see that. The land that the Danites chose not only had springs of water that never failed, they had the melting snow coming off of Hermon. It was fertile. There was water. It was wonderful, but it wasn't where God wanted them to be because they did what was right in their own eyes. Now, this is what happens along the way. They stop at Micah's along the way, and they recognize this Levite who was bouncing around looking for a job, and they ask this Levite, is our journey going to be okay? Almost like going to a prophet. And they get this positive response. Go in peace. The journey on which you go is under the eye of the Lord. Well, that was true. Everything is under the eye of the Lord, but not everything is God's will. And so we have to have an application here. There's coming a time where they're right now. The time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itchy ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions. Should we go up and take the land? Sure, it's under the eye of the Lord. And they'll turn away from listening to the truth and wander off into the myths. In the Olivet Discourse, when Jesus said, because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold, he was talking about apostasy. He was talking about turning from the truth. And we're in those days today. And I'll have to add this. I saw this in a sign in Little Britain several years ago. Just because we have the right to do something doesn't mean it's right to do. So the scouts find the city of Laish, which they're going to rename to Dan. And this is how they found it: quiet and unsuspecting, lacking nothing that is in the earth. What we're going to see is these people are all looking on the horizontal and not looking vertically. They said that we saw it and it was quiet, unsuspecting, lacking nothing. Everything we ever wanted is right there, and possessing wealth on top of that. They go back to the tribe and they tell the tribe what's happening. And this is their message: for God has given it into your hands. You know, sometimes God is blamed for things that he has nothing to do with. Okay? I feel led to be a missionary to Tahiti. Well, I don't know if Tahiti needs missionaries, but maybe God is saying Alaska. For God has given it into your hands, a place where there is no lack of anything that is in the earth. So the 5 scouts, 600 special forces, the other 60,000 plus are left down in the south. They're going to go up and do a mission. 5 scouts, 600 special forces, and their families. They go up, and what do? They stop at the house of Micah. And the scouts happen to mention that there are graven images in the house. They said, you know, when I came down here, when we came down here and reported that some guy told us that it's going to be okay, we'll do this under the eyes of the Lord. He lives here, and these are his gods. So think about it. What should we do about he living here and giving us that positive report, twitching ears? Compare that to consider, you know, the scout said, consider what you will do. The response to that is, consider Jesus, the apostle and the high priest of our confession. Hebrews 12 says, don't look horizontally, look vertically, looking unto Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith. So what do you do about situations? Consider this, whatever your weak spot happens to be. Lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, pride of life, whatever it is, anger, impatience, whatever it is. How do you deal with that? Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. There's one exception to that: resist the devil, and that's youthful lust. The Bible says, flee ye, don't fight it. Flee ye youthful lusts. Draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded. So the scouts take the idols, while the 600 are standing by right alongside the Levite. So here's this Levite. He doesn't want to go anywhere. He's a happy camper, but there are 600 armed special forces sitting there. The scouts pick up the idols, and the Levite protested, as he should. But he gets invited to go along and be the priest for everybody, for the entire tribe. So scouts, you don't have to carry that stuff. I'll carry the gods for you. And we see the priest's heart was glad. He took the ephod and the household gods and the carved image and went along with the people. It's another section from James. If you have bitter envy and jealous, and I've got so much King James in my mind, please forgive me. If you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambitions in your heart, do not boast and be false to the truth. That Levite, he had a vain ambition. He went from just wandering, looking for a place to be, to being pulled into becoming the father and the priest, spiritual father and priest of Micah, to be in front of the entire tribe. If the tribe was going to do tithes, instead of getting tithes from one guy, he gets tithes from the 1/12 of Israel. So he was an ambitious guy. If you are in that mode, this is not wisdom that comes from above, but it's earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. And we're going to see what kind of vile practice is in store for us here. But the wisdom that's from above is pure, peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy, good fruits, impartial, and sincere. So now the Levite protested. He's surrounded by 600 guys. Now he's carrying the goods. And now it's Micah's turn, the owner of the house. It's Micah's turn to protest. He said, what's wrong with you guys? What is the matter with you? You take my gods that I made and my priest and you go away. What if I have left? Let me tell you something. If somebody steals your God, you're serving the wrong God. And the 600 people respond, be quiet or die. In other words, too bad for you. But the people of Dan took what Micah had made and the priest who belonged to him, and they came to Laish, to a people quiet and unsuspecting, and struck them with the edge of the sword and burned the city with fire. And there was no deliverer because it was far from Sidon, and they had no dealings with anyone. It was in the valley that belongs to Beth Rehob, wide open spaces. You saw the photograph. Then they rebuilt the city and lived in it. And they named the city Dan after the name of Dan, their ancestor, who was born to Israel. But the name of the city was Laish at the first. We're going to see some interesting manuscript situations here. Let me read the verse. And the people of Dan set up the carved image for themselves. And Jonathan, son of Gershom, son of Moses, King James says Manasseh, will explain that, and his sons were priests to the tribe of the Danites until the day of the captivity of the land. King James says Manasseh. Modern translations say Moses. I checked in with the rabbi, and the rabbi says it's Manasseh. This is what happened. Somewhere along the line, you have one manuscript that says Moses, another manuscript that says Manasseh, and the supposition is maybe it said Moses and they added the N in the middle and it became Manasseh, so he didn't have to embarrass the name of Moses because his grandson was a derelict. You look up Gershom, and his descendants are in the Chronicles, and Jonathan's not mentioned. So the argument is, well, this fella had his name changed from Jonathan. You all can have to decide. But let's take for a moment the assumption that it was Moses' grandson. Think of the degradation of that tribe to go from a man who spoke with God face to face to a grandson who gave up the faith. Now, I also highlighted the phrase, until the day of the captivity of the land. Now, most folks would say that Samuel was the one who wrote the book of Judges. But the Assyrian captivity didn't occur till centuries later. One argument is, just like Moses used the name Dan, that he was prophesying that the Danites would take over Laish, just the same way, Samuel, who was a prophet, was prophesying here that the land was going to fall into captivity. There's a school of thought that says this. There's a scribe in the Bible whose name is Ezra. And you know, if you read Deuteronomy, which was written by Moses, in the last chapter, Moses dies and gets buried. Now, did he write that out for himself? Or did somebody add that on there as a postscript? Moses was a prophet. We've studied that many a time. Maybe Moses did prophesy exactly the way he died and was buried. Or maybe it was Ezra, the scribe, who added that to the tail end. But I said all that to say this. When we believe in the inerrancy of Scripture, it's not a battle. My translation is better than your translation. That's not the point at all. The Scriptures are God-breathed and inerrant in their original manuscript. none of which exist. At least we haven't found them yet. But where there are discrepancies, they never violate the bulldogmatic scriptures, the virgin birth, the death, the burial, the resurrection, the soon coming. None of that stuff's ever touched. So they set up Micah's carved image that he made as long as the house of God was at Shiloh. So now back to the history, that's not so bad, because the tabernacle stayed at Shiloh until the times of Eli, who was the predecessor to Samuel. And if you can recall the story, they took the Ark of the Covenant and they thought they were going to use it as a charm against the Philistines. Eli's sons also go along. The battle is fought. Both sons die. The ark is taken captive into the Philistines. A messenger comes back and says to Eli, your sons are dead and the ark has been taken, and Eli falls off a bench and dies. Well, as long as the house of God was at Shiloh. And so here you have in 2 Samuel what happened to that ark after the Philistines took it. And the men of Kiriath Jearim came and took up the ark of the Lord and brought it to the house of Abinadab on the hill, and they consecrated his son Eleazar to have charge of the ark of the Lord. And so you see what happens there. The notion of idolatry was set up in a formal institution in the northern part of the nation of Israel, all the way until the northern part was taken away. Chapter 19. Shifting gears. And in those days, when there was no king in Israel, I told you you're going to see that phrase several times, a certain Levite. It doesn't say if it's the same one. It simply says a certain Levite was sojourning, was abiding in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah, and his concubine was unfaithful to him. Well, that comes as no surprise, because they're all doing what is right in their own eyes. And she went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah and was there some 4 months. So I don't know what the Levite was doing for 4 months, but he's missing his girlfriend and he decides to go find her. He shows up at the house of the girlfriend, the concubine, and the father, and he parties with dad 5 days and nights. Well, I don't know about you, but I found my daughter's purity sacred. And somebody messes with one of my daughters, they've got a very serious problem on their hands. We'll say, well, that was consensual, the concubine. She was certainly consensual. She went and she was unfaithful to him. As we study these last chapters, the question, what would we do in that situation, applies every one of these tales, every one of these narratives. And that's repent and go to God. So he's partying 5 days, and every day he wakes up, he says, well, it's time for me to take your daughter and go. And the dad isn't saying, no, you're not. The dad's saying, just hang in there. We'll party yet another day. But at dusk of the 5th day, the Levite departs with his concubine. It's not like they all climbed in their minivan and went up the interstate. They took their donkey, they go out at dark, and the streets are not lit. There was no electricity. There weren't gas lights. And because everybody's doing what is right in their own eyes, it was a very dangerous journey. So you see that number 1 up above? That's where the Levite and the concubine starts. The concubine goes down to Bethlehem to move back in with dad. And we read, but the man would not spend the night, that 5th night. He rose up and departed and arrived opposite Jebus, that is Jerusalem. You see the number 3 in the middle of the map. He had with him a couple of saddled donkeys, and his concubine was with him. And when they neared Jebus, the day was nearly over, and the servant said to his master, come now, let us turn aside to this city of the Jebusites and spend the night in it. And his master said to him, we will not turn aside into the city of foreigners who do not belong to the people of Israel, but we will pass on to Gibeah. And you see Gibeah number 4 with the great big red pointer there. Sometimes Christians could be more honorable. I'm sorry. Sometimes non-Christians can be more honorable than Christians. And what we're going to see here is the Levite says, no, we're not going to stay in that pagan city. We're going to go to a Christian city. And we're going to see what happens when he gets to that town. And behold, an old man was coming from his work in the field that evening, and the man was from the hill country of Ephraim, just like that Levite, and he was sojourning in Gibeah. The men of the place were Benjaminites. And he lifted up his eyes and saw the traveler in the open square of the city, and the old man said, where are you going and where are you coming from? And the old man takes him into his house and shows hospitality. Now, hospitality for us is very different than hospitality for them. Hospitality for us would mean if you're taking in an overnight guest, you would feed them, you would offer them to take a shower, you'd give them fresh towels, give them fresh sheets, you try to be quiet, let them have a good night's rest, they're all traveling. Well, these people do all that and then some. Even till today, if a Bedouin offers you hospitality in his tent, that is a sanctuary. No one will ever, ever bother you. They will protect you with their life. Very different. So the men of the city, the Benjaminites, the Christians in the analogy that we're going through here, the parallel, the men of the city want to sodomize the Levite, just like Sodom and Gomorrah. And the old man offers his daughter and the concubine instead. Now, if I were the daughter, I'd say, gee, thanks, Dad. And we're going to see another gee, thanks, Dad again if the clock behaves itself. So he offers the women instead, and what happens? Unlike Sodom and Gomorrah, they say, okay, we'll take the consolation prize, we'll take the concubine. And they abuse the concubine all night long. And as morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where the master was until it was light. So here's this woman abused all night long. I can picture her crawling back to that house. She makes it to the threshold, doesn't have enough energy to even knock on the door, and there she dies. And her master rose up in the morning, and when he opened the door of the house and went out to go on his way, oh, well, I lost that concubine. I guess I'll find me another one somewhere along the line. Doing what was right in his own eyes. When he got up to go on his way, behold, there was his concubine lying at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. And I can see her poking with the foot and say, come on, get up, it's time to go. But what happens? He said to her, get up, let us be going. But there was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man rose up and went away to his home. So he's starting outside the city. And when he entered his house, now he's back up in Ephraim. And when he entered his house, he took a knife, and taking hold of his concubine, he divided her limb by limb into 12 pieces and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. And all who saw it said, such a thing has never happened or been seen from the day that the people of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it. There we see that word consider again. Did they look up to Jesus? Did they look up to their Yahweh? No. They stayed horizontal. And that takes us to chapter 20. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So the death of that concubine leads to civil war. 400,000 soldiers from all of Israel assembled to hear what happened. They want to hear firsthand what's going on. They got this piece of the concubine. Now they want to find out for sure what was the real deal. And the Levites said, I came to Gibeah that belongs to Benjamin, I and my concubine, to spend the night. And the leaders of Gibeah rose against me and surrounded the house against me by night, and they meant to kill me, and they violated my concubine, and she is dead. So I took hold of my concubine and cut her in pieces and sent her throughout all the country by the inheritance of Israel, for they have committed abomination and outrage in Israel. Behold, you people of Israel, all of you, give your advice and counsel here. So here's the Levite in front of 400,000 men. He recites what happened to him, and then he's saying, so what are you going to do about it? One dead concubine leads to the deaths of over 60,000 soldiers, plus an unknown number of women and children. It was Tecumseh Sherman at the time of the Civil War who said, war is hell. And there are different schools of thought about war. Some folks say no war at any price. There's a doctrine called just war, not just war meaning only war, but a war that is justified. But the question is, what do you do in the face of those kinds of things? I already gave the answer. Repent. What is going on? So they chose to go to war. The Israelites asked the Benjaminites to surrender the guilty men, but the Benjamites refused. So far, they did what you would think is the right thing to do. So war begins. Those 400,000 against almost 30,000. Odds were better than 10-1. The people of Israel arose and went up to Bethel and inquired of God. Now they start to pray. Well, we're going to see that God is actually answering these prayers. So far, so good. They're doing what God would have expected them to do. Who shall go up first for us to fight against the people of Benjamin? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up first. Well, that should be no surprise, because every time the question was which tribe should fight first, it's always Judah. And in those verses, you see the first 22,000 of Israelites are killed. They're losing in their battles. And the people of Israel went up and wept before the Lord until the evening, and they inquired of the Lord, shall we again draw near to fight against our brothers, the people of Benjamin? And God answers this prayer. And the Lord said, go up against them. So far, they're doing what God is saying is the right thing. So they go up. They lose another 18,000 soldiers. And they inquire of the Lord again. Now, here you see Phinehas, who is the grandson of Aaron. Is the grandson of Aaron on one side of the battle, and maybe the grandson of Moses, his second cousin, on the other side of the battle? We don't know. But again, it shows how quickly a nation could be fallen into reprobate. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, ministered before it in these days, saying, shall we go out once more to battle against our brothers, the people of Benjamin, or shall we cease? And the Lord said, go up, for tomorrow I will give them into your hand. It was God's will for this thing to fight, and God is going to give them the victory. So day 3, Israel sets up an ambush, draws Benjamin out of the city. The Israelites come out of ambush, they attack, and they kill 25,000 Benjamites. We're not going to go through the details of the battle. So the people of Benjamin saw that they were defeated, and 600 survivors retreat. They did not retreat to the Lord. They did not retreat to Shiloh, the site of the tabernacle. They retreated to the rock of Rimmon. Rimmon is the name of a Syrian god. So they're going, so to speak, from the pan to the fire. Then the Israelites go overboard. God said, I was going to give those men to you in battle, but he did not say to do this. And the men of Israel turned back against the people of Benjamin and struck them with the edge of the sword, the city, the men, and the beasts, and all that they found, and all the towns that they found, they set on fire. What you see here is those 400,000 soldiers killed off all the men of Benjamin, except those 600 that hightailed it out of there. Chapter 21. Again, that verse front and center in chapter 21 ends with that verse. Verse 25 is the last verse of the book of Judges. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Now, the men of Israel had sworn in Mizpah, that's where they had their gathering place. It was on the other side of the Jordan in Gilead. No one of us shall give his daughter in marriage to Benjamin. Okay, in that case, God, what should we do? What shall we do for wives, for those who are left, since we have sworn by the Lord that we will not give them any of our daughters for wives? Note, no response from God. They've gone to God several times and God gave them an answer. Now they're on their own. And sometimes, I don't hear from God, but I still have his word. And there used to be a fad out, the bracelets. What would Jesus do? What would these guys do? And the people had compassion on Benjamin. They're on the right track. The people had compassion on Benjamin because the Lord had made a breach in the tribes of Israel. So what did they do? They got 600 of their daughters and they set them up to be kidnapped by those 600 guys. And the people of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his tribe and family. And they went out from there, every man to his inheritance. They swore that they were never going to give one of their daughters to one of those 600 guys. So instead, they let their daughter get kidnapped and go live with those guys. Does that mean that come Thanksgiving Day, there's going to be an empty seat? The Bible doesn't say if there was ever a reconciliation. The Bible never says what they did. The Bible doesn't even say if those 600 happened to be the guilty ones. They just happen to be 600 soldiers that managed to survive. The people of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his tribe and family, and they went out from there, every man to his inheritance. And there's that verse again. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Got 8 minutes. I'm going to give you a very high-level overview of the book of Ruth. It's a whole 85 verses. So I'm going to encourage you, and you got 2 weeks to read it because we don't have Sunday school next week. If you don't read 85 verses in 2 weeks, shame on you. Do the math quickly. That's 7 verses a day. I think we can handle it. The book of Ruth. First of all, it's a story of history. There you see a timeline of judges. We're going to talk about Samuel versus Samson in their discussions. And there you see the Ruth story with question marks. They're not sure exactly where within the story it is, but we know it's on that timeline because Ruth 1 says, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. We read in the genealogy of Jesus, this is the genealogy that goes down to Joseph, Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. Boaz was the son of a harlot. And he ends up marrying a Moabitess. And I'm going into the details, suffice it to say, it was a story of history. It's part of the books of history, as we call some of the Old Testament books. It was a story of faith in a sinful world. We're going to be introduced to Ruth's father-in-law, whose name was Elimelech, which means the Lord is my king. There was no king in Israel, but yet there's a man. The Lord is my king. He had a king, and his name was Yahweh. And so you can go down and read the contrasts between what's happening in the book of Judges and what's happening in the book of Ruth. And right smack in the middle, you find in those days, there was a king in Israel. It was in Elimelech's heart. And some people managed to do what was right in God's eyes, even though everybody else in the nation has gone off the deep end. That's the light that's in the tunnel. That's the redemptive story of Ruth. So it's a story of history. It's a story of faith in a sinful world, and it's a love story. I'm sure many of you, probably all of you, have read the story. It's a story of Ruth becoming a widow. It's a story of Ruth being loyal to her mother. The two of them go back to Bethlehem, and we see Ruth is going to honor her mother by doing the gleaning and bring whatever kind of food back. And she runs into Boaz, and Boaz runs into Ruth, and the two get married. So it's a love story. It's also a story of God's grace and redemption. We'll see 85 verses. The name of God is mentioned 22 times. The notion of being redeemed or redemptor or a kinsman redeemer 23 times in 85 verses. So you can see where it's a story of grace. It's a story of God's redemption. It's the story, we're going to introduce the notion of the kinsman redeemer and go back to Deuteronomy to see where it all came from. It's a story of prophecy. Of course, everybody's ears go bing on prophecy, right? Quick commercial. Wednesday evenings, we shifted gears. We started Wednesday evening talking about the prophecies that are inside Daniel. When we're done with those, we're going to talk about the wars that are inside Ezekiel. And I'll tell you, read your news. And then after that, we're going to fill in the blanks, and we're going to take a verse-by-verse study of the book of Revelation. That should take us right through the rest of the year because we always shut down for summertime. But the book of Ruth is also a book of prophecy. Well, where do you get that, John? I've read that book before. Naomi is a picture of Israel. And what happened to Israel between the year 70 and 135 AD? In the year 70, their temple was destroyed. In the year 135, the entire city was deported, and they were deported from the land of, at that point, it was called Palestine. Just like Naomi, she and her husband deported themselves, just like the two of them left. And once 70 AD comes and goes, and 135 AD comes and goes, we now have the church history and the story of redemption. Jesus Christ, he said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And Israel has been locked out of the land of Israel. Say, okay, in 1948, they got the real estate back. But just like Naomi calls herself bitter up until the bride and the groom, when the bride and the groom arrive in Jerusalem, then Israel, Naomi, will once again say, don't call me bitter, but call me blessed. No longer call me Mara, but call me Naomi. We're going to stop on these names, and we'll take ourselves right up to 945. Bethlehem means the house of bread. And it's ironic that there was a famine. There's no bread in the house of bread. I already mentioned to you that Elimelech means my God is my king inside the time of Israel when everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. Moab means of my father. Moab was the illegitimate son of Lot and one of his daughters. But Psalm 108 calls it God's wash basin. And in God's wash basin, Ruth comes from being a Moabitess to becoming a proselyte. She becomes a Jewish girl. And through Ruth, baby Jesus is born. I mentioned to you Naomi, how she changed her name from pleasant to bitter and back again to pleasant. And we see those two boys, Mahlon and Chilion, and we're going to stop right there on Mahlon and Chilion. One's name means sickly, the other names mean pinely, and I'll just say sick and tired. I'm going to give Elimelech and Naomi the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to say, there they were in the land of Israel, in the tribe of Benjamin. Keep in mind the Benjamites are sodomites, and it's just a really ugly scene. And they named their kids Sick and Tired because they must have been sick and tired of the carryings on that was in the nation of Israel. And they said, we're getting out.